Julia Bennett smiled as she stirred the soup on the stove, unaware that her obsession with her teenage stepdaughter, Emily, would soon spiral into a deadly secret buried beneath the illusion of a perfect suburban life. Julia Bennett stood at the edge of her manicured lawn, waving at her neighbor as the school bus rolled by. To everyone in Pine Hill, she was the ideal wife and stepmother. Her days were spent tending to her garden, organizing fundraisers, and preparing homemade meals for her small, blended family. She had married Thomas Bennett 6 years ago, shortly after his first wife died in a tragic car accident. Julia had no children of her own, but she stepped into the role of mother for Thomas's only daughter, Emily, who was 13 at the time. Now at 19, Emily was a soft-spoken college freshman, still living at home while attending the local community college. Their home, nestled on a quiet suburban street, looked no different from the others. White shutters, a swing on the porch, and flower beds blooming under the front windows. It gave off the appearance of safety, routine, and comfort. No one ever questioned what went on inside. Thomas worked long hours as a contractor, often leaving early in the morning and returning late at night. His work paid well, allowing Julia the luxury of staying home full-time. Their marriage wasn't passionate, but it was stable. They rarely argued, and when they did, it ended in silence rather than conflict. To the outside world, their family was whole. Julia was polite and charming at community events, always volunteering, always smiling. Thomas was reserved, but respectable. Emily, though quiet, was known to be well-mannered and smart. There was no drama, no scandals, just ordinary life, or so it seemed. Over the years, something subtle began to shift. Julia, once enthusiastic about her role in the family, began to feel invisible. Her efforts often went unnoticed by Thomas, who seemed more consumed by work than by the woman he'd married. Their conversations turned transactional. The distance between them grew, unspoken but felt. Julia found herself watching Emily more often, not just in a maternal way, but with a kind of fascination she couldn't name at first. Emily had grown into a beautiful young woman, with long dark hair and a softness in her voice that Julia found soothing. They began spending more time together, just the two of them. Emily, still grieving her mother in quiet ways, leaned on Julia for comfort. They would talk late into the night, bake together, or spend hours watching old movies. In the den, Thomas was rarely around, and when he was, he seemed to exist in another orbit entirely. At first, Julia told herself it was just affection, normal closeness between a stepmother and daughter. But her feelings began to twist in her mind, slowly but surely. She felt alive when Emily laughed at her jokes, or when their hands brushed while reaching for the same spoon. There was a warmth, a pull she hadn't felt in years. She didn't push it away. She let it linger, let it grow, allowed herself to believe it was love in some new and pure form. And Emily, still unsure of her place in the world, found comfort in Julia's attention. It felt like safety, like family. No one noticed the subtle changes. How Julia started dressing differently. How she stopped mentioning Thomas in conversations. How Emily stopped going out with friends and spent all her weekends at home. The neighbors, even the closest ones, missed all the warning signs. They saw only what Julia wanted them to see: a tidy home, a polite daughter, a hardworking husband, and a devoted wife. But behind the windows, behind the smiles, the truth was something much darker. Something neither woman fully understood yet. Something that would only be revealed when it was far too late. It began with small gestures, innocent on the surface, but layered with unspoken meaning. Julia would linger a little too long when brushing a strand of hair from Emily's face. She began giving her unexpected gifts: a silk scarf, a vintage necklace, a pair of shoes Emily had once admired in a shop window. These were not ordinary stepmotherly offerings. They were tokens, subtle expressions of something deeper Julia didn't want to say out loud. At first, Emily seemed flattered, even grateful. She had never known this kind of closeness with her birth mother, who had been kind but distant. Julia, in contrast, was attentive and emotional. She asked questions, offered advice, and listened intently. It felt good to be seen. The boundaries between them blurred gradually. Their shared moments became more personal. Julia began confiding in Emily about her loneliness, about how unfulfilled she felt in her marriage. She spoke in vague, wistful terms about how she thought love was supposed to feel different, more alive. Emily listened, unsure of how to respond. She felt a mix of sympathy and confusion. Julia's vulnerability created an intimacy that made it hard to draw lines. They started sleeping in the same bed on nights when Thomas was out of town, watching movies until they fell asleep. It was framed as harmless, but something inside Emily knew it wasn't. Still, she said nothing. She didn't want to hurt Julia. And truthfully, she wasn't sure she wanted it to stop, that Julia's attention was overwhelming. She started getting jealous when Emily talked about classmates, especially male ones. She asked to see her messages, under the pretense of concern. Emily, conditioned by the growing bond and Julia's emotional fragility, complied. Slowly, she stopped texting friends. She stayed home more. Julia had become the center of her world, and she didn't realize how isolated she had become until it was already too late. Thomas remained unaware. His focus was always on work, and when he was home, he seemed exhausted and emotionally absent. He missed the subtle changes in his daughter's behavior, the way she avoided eye contact, how she flinched slightly when touched unexpectedly, or how her smile looked more like a mask. Julia played her part well. She kept the house in perfect order. She laughed at Thomas's jokes, cooked his favorite meals, and never once gave him a reason to question her loyalty. To him, everything was fine, but inside the house, Julia's feelings were tightening around Emily like a rope. She would cry if Emily tried to go out. She made her promises to keep their connection just between them, to never leave her, to never tell Thomas. Emily began to feel trapped. What had started as affection had turned into something controlling, even suffocating. But every time she thought about pulling away, Julia would break down. She would claim she couldn't live without her, that no one had ever made her feel loved the way Emily did. Emily, still young and unsure of herself, didn't know how to fight back. She believed she owed Julia something for all the care, the comfort, the support she had given. She tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe it wasn't wrong. Maybe this was love in a different form. But the nagging discomfort never left her. The secret they shared hung heavily in the air, unspoken but always present. Every glance, every accidental touch, every quiet night alone deepened the silence between them. And with each passing day, Julia's grip tightened, her dependence growing, her obsession deepening. What neither of them realized was that the foundation beneath them had already started to crack. And when it finally gave way, nothing would be left standing. The shift began quietly, with a missed message and a forgotten password. One late afternoon, while Julia was folding laundry, Thomas arrived home unexpectedly early from a canceled job site. Emily's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, screen lit up with a message preview. He wouldn't have looked. He never had before, but something about the sender's name made him pause. The message was from Julia's secondary email account, one he didn't even know she used. The words on the screen were brief but alarming. "I missed the way you looked at me last night. I need you tonight. Please." Thomas stood frozen. His first reaction wasn't anger, but confusion. It didn't make sense. He had never suspected Julia of being unfaithful, let alone with someone in their home. His hands trembled as he opened more of the messages. There were photos, selfies, blurry mirror shots of Julia, some clothed, some not. And beneath each image, words that made his stomach twist. There was no mistaking it. These were not messages sent to a friend or confidant. They were romantic, desperate, obsessive. And the most disturbing part, every reply came from Emily. Shock turned to disbelief. He stared at the evidence, trying to convince himself there was a misunderstanding. But the messages continued over weeks. Messages only someone in the same house could send and respond to with such frequency. He scrolled through their digital trail, and the truth sank in. His wife was having a secret affair with his daughter. His daughter, who had once cried for her mother's touch, now entangled in something unnatural and grotesque. That night, Thomas didn't confront Julia. He watched silently, analyzing every gesture, every word between her and Emily. The way they looked at each other now seemed filled with meaning he hadn't noticed before. The inside jokes, the glances, the quiet whispering in the kitchen, they all took on a sinister tone. He barely slept. The next morning, he left without saying a word and didn't return for 3 days. When he did, it was only to collect a bag and say he was filing for divorce. Julia reacted with panic, not remorse. She begged him to stay, to talk, to forget. She claimed he misunderstood everything. But her voice cracked, and the desperation in her eyes gave her away. Thomas wouldn't listen. He left the house for good and began legal proceedings immediately. In the small town of Pine Hill, rumors spread fast. But this story didn't leak. Thomas kept it quiet, protecting his daughter's name and shielding his own reputation. Julia, however, fell apart. With Thomas gone, her attention on Emily intensified. But Emily, now beginning to realize the full weight of what had happened, began to pull away. The guilt settled in. She had never considered herself a victim until she began to see Julia's behavior for what it was. The possessiveness, the emotional manipulation, the way she had slowly turned her against her father and her friends. What she thought was love now felt like control. And as Julia grew more frantic, Emily grew more afraid. She began spending more time at school, staying out later, avoiding Julia's texts. But Julia wouldn't let go. She became erratic, showing up unexpectedly at campus, crying, threatening to hurt herself if Emily didn't come home. The pressure became unbearable. Emily didn't know where to turn. She couldn't tell her father, not now, not after everything. Then Julia proposed one last weekend away. Just the two of them. One final escape to the old family cabin by the lake, a place filled with childhood memories and, Julia hoped, a chance to fix everything. Emily hesitated. She knew she should say no, but guilt spoke louder than reason. And that decision would become the last one she would ever make. The drive to the cabin was quiet. Emily stared out the window, watching the trees blur past as the road wound deeper into the woods. Julia spoke only once or twice, commenting on the weather, pointing out how beautiful the lake would look this time of year. Her voice was strained, her usual softness replaced by something colder, more distant. Emily nodded politely, replying with short answers, trying to keep the peace. She had agreed to come only because Julia promised it would be a weekend to reflect, to talk, and then to let go. Julia had even said she understood that things had gone too far, that Emily needed space. Emily wanted to believe her. The cabin sat alone at the edge of the lake, just as Emily remembered. They hadn't been there in years. The place smelled of damp wood and old memories. Inside, everything looked untouched. There were family photos still on the walls. Emily at 10, Thomas holding a fishing rod, Julia smiling wide beside them. It was eerie, like stepping into a snapshot of a time that no longer existed. Julia unpacked quickly, setting up their old routines, making cocoa, lighting the fireplace, laying out thick blankets. She kept smiling, too wide, too often. Emily felt the tension rise with every moment that passed. That night, they sat by the fire in silence. Julia tried to reminisce about old times, but Emily barely responded. She just wanted to get through the weekend and go home. When she got up to go to bed early, Julia watched her with glassy eyes. She didn't say good night, WY morning. The mood had shifted. Julia seemed calmer, more composed, even cheerful. She suggested they go for a walk by the lake, something they used to do when Emily was younger. Emily agreed, though every instinct told her not to. The path was narrow and damp with morning dew. Birds chirped overhead, and the lake shimmered under the sunlight. Julia walked close beside her, occasionally reaching for her hand. Emily pulled away gently, pretending not to notice. Near the edge of the water, Julia stopped. She turned to Emily and said something strange. How things were better when it was just the two of them. How she wished they could go back to that time. Emily didn't respond. She stared at the lake, heart pounding, wanting nothing more than to leave. That's when Julia reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a letter. She handed it to Emily with a trembling hand. Inside was a handwritten message, a kind of confession. Julia wrote about how she felt invisible, how Thomas never loved her, how Emily had saved her from complete despair. She called their relationship the only thing that ever made her feel alive. And at the bottom, she wrote one final sentence. If you leave me, I will have nothing left. Emily folded the letter slowly, her chest tightening. She looked at Julia, whose eyes were now filled with tears, but there was something else behind them, something desperate, unhinged. Emily stepped back and said she wanted to go home. That's when Julia moved fast. There was a struggle, sudden and violent. Julia pushed Emily to the ground near the water's edge, hands shaking, words tumbling out that didn't make sense. Accusations, pleas, apologies. Emily screamed, tried to run, but Julia pinned her down. When it was over, the lake was still. Julia sat by the shoreline, her clothes soaked, her breathing ragged. Emily's body lay motionless a few feet away, wrapped in a wool blanket. Julia stared at the water for hours before finally picking up the phone and dialing 911. Her voice was barely audible as she told them there had been an accident, that her daughter had fallen into the lake, that she tried to save her, that it was too late. The police arrived to a chilling scene. Julia sitting quietly beside the body, the confession letter nearby, and no signs of a drowning. What they found instead told a much darker story. The investigation into Emily's death began immediately. Julia's account was simple: an accidental fall, a failed rescue, a tragic loss. She claimed they had gone for a walk by the lake, that Emily slipped, hit her head, and fell into the water. Julia said she dove in to save her, but was too late. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed plausible, but the responding officers noticed things that didn't add up. Julia's clothing was barely wet. Her hair was dry. There were no scrapes or bruises on her body to suggest a fall or a struggle in the water. More troubling were the marks on Emily's neck, faint but visible, like bruises left by pressure, something no drowning would cause. The coroner's report confirmed the worst. Emily hadn't drowned. She had died from asphyxiation due to manual strangulation. There was water in her lungs, but not enough to be fatal. The bruising around her neck and the petechial hemorrhages in her eyes told a different story. Emily had been alive when Julia held her down, but not for long. Julia was arrested 2 days later, charged with first-degree murder. In interviews, she remained composed but evasive. She denied any wrongdoing, repeated her story, and clung to the idea that it had all been a horrible accident. But the evidence grew too heavy to ignore. Investigators found the handwritten letter Julia had given Emily, as well as dozens of unsent letters and journal entries at the cabin and their home. In them, Julia chronicled her growing obsession with Emily, her frustration with Thomas, and her fear of being abandoned. One entry, dated a week before the trip, was particularly damning. She wants to leave. She says it's wrong. But how? Can it be wrong when it's the only thing that's ever felt right? If she walks away, I'll have no reason to exist. I won't let her walk away. The prosecution built their case on these documents, along with phone records, deleted messages, and witness statements from friends who had noticed Emily's recent withdrawal. They portrayed Julia as a manipulative woman who used emotional coercion to isolate her stepdaughter and create a toxic, controlling relationship. When Emily finally tried to break free, Julia saw no future without her. In her mind, if she couldn't have Emily, no one could. The trial gripped the community. Pine Hill, once quiet and uneventful, became the center of national headlines. People struggled to reconcile the image of the cheerful, involved wife and stepmother with the woman accused of such a chilling crime. In court, Julia showed little emotion. She refused to testify. Her defense claimed mental illness, arguing she suffered from untreated trauma and a dissociative episode the night Emily died. But the jury didn't believe it. After only 2 days of deliberation, Julia Bennett was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Thomas did not attend the sentencing. After Emily's death, he disappeared from public life. He sold the house and moved out of state, leaving behind a neighborhood that now whispered his family's name with pity and horror. Emily's funeral was small, private. Only a few friends and relatives attended. No eulogies were read, just silence and the wind through the trees. The house on Maple Drive stood empty for months. Eventually, a new family moved in, unaware of the tragedy that unfolded inside its walls. But for those who remembered, the story of Julia and Emily Bennett became more than just another crime. It became a cautionary tale about obsession disguised as love, about control that masquerades as care, and about how evil can wear the most ordinary face.